And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Watson. We are joined by Eleanor Nell Watson for this segment. She is a researcher in emerging technologies whose work focuses on the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and the values of the human spirit into the development of AI, that's artificial intelligence. She serves as senior scientific advisor to the Future Society, AI researcher at Singularity University, and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. And you can follow Nell on Twitter at Nell Watson and on our website, nellwatson.com. Nell, here's the thing. We're going to get into the coronavirus strain that appears to be emerging, at the very least in UK, although, as I saw you talking about, potentially also in South Africa. I want to actually come back to that, though. Real quick, and this is a little bit of a particular interest of mine. Singularity University, didn't that turn into Miri at some point, or is that its own thing still these days? You know what I'm talking about?
Sure. I think Singularity University and Miri, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, those are very separate organizations with rather different goals in mind. The Machine Intelligence Research Institute is focused on helping to safeguard humanity against rogue, strong AI, so very, very intelligent future AI. Singularity University has a rather different mission. It's more about preparing humanity for a future, although much less focused on the risk from AI.
Okay, that you know what, that does make sense, and that fits the ethos of the two orgs. For some reason, and this is probably just a fluke of my memory, something getting corrupted, but I remember there being a sense of segue from one to the other back in like the late knots, something like that, 2008, 2009, 2010, or 11. I don't know. That's probably just a fluke of my memory. In any event, that's my particular thing out of the way. Interesting stuff to talk about, though, definitely, and maybe we can come back to that at some point. But regardless, I saw you talking about the new strain circulating in the UK. Can you give us the latest? What is this new strain? Is it more lethal? It seems to be more infectious, but what are the facts now?
Well, it's difficult to get verified information because things are at such an early stage, but there have been a couple of papers which have been quickly published on this emerging issue. It does seem as if a new strain has evolved and appears to be centered on the UK, as far as we know, and it has up to 22 new mutations. And this is rather strange because all of these mutations appear to have arrived without any intermediary. So there's no sort of missing link, in a sense. There's no chain of evolution from prior strains. They have appeared de novo. And it seems as if some patient was very sick for a very long time, and over a period of many months, they created this strange new strain. Now, from epidemiological transmission studies on the population, it does seem as if this new strain is outcompeting other strains, and that it does seem to be a great deal more infectious, perhaps up to 70% more infectious. However, there is no evidence yet that this strain is in any way more deadly. In fact, it may be slightly milder for all we know, but it definitely does seem to be more likely to spread. At least that's what the evidence is telling us for now.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I've been reading some of the stuff on the new strain. This is Eric, is a doctor that I follow on Twitter, or epidemiologist. Scientists have raised the possibility that the increase in transmission is maybe due to kids. A new detail in the UK muted variant. New strain may make kids as equally as susceptible as adults, says virologist at Imperial College in London. This would be extremely significant. I mean, in the US, for the most part, like you said, they haven't necessarily found the strain in the US. But if the strain does get to the US, and the strain is outcompeting, and whereas beforehand the thought was kids aren't spreading it as fast because they aren't getting it as bad. If all of that is out the window, we're in for a very long time, correct? I mean, am I wrong in looking at this with somewhat of a dark eye in thinking that this is just going to get worse before it gets better?
Well, you're quite correct. There is some supposition that children do seem to be spreading it more than was expected. But we still don't know whether that's directly connected with this strain. However, there is an operating hypothesis that yes, children are more easily infected by this strain of the virus. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that children are likely to have worse outcomes or are more likely to be affected. But perhaps they could be more likely to spread it. And I think those who make decisions about whether schools should remain open or not should probably take this into account.
Another larger question: when these viruses mutate, it seems that the trend, at the very least, is for them to get less lethal and more infectious as time goes on. Is that not the case? It seems like that matches with what happened with the Spanish flu. Is that wrong though? No.
Generally speaking, that's the pattern. It doesn't always operate that way. Sometimes you get a mutation that is potentially more deadly or more damaging in some other way. For example, a strain that might cause damage to organs or nerves, but doesn't necessarily kill people any faster. But typically speaking, viruses do tend to get weaker over time because there tend to be selection pressures that mean that it's better for the virus, I suppose, to not kill somebody so that they can wander about and infect other people, or rather to not make somebody so ill that they wish to stay in bed all day rather than going out and infecting others. So it would seem to fit that pattern. However, from the example of the Spanish flu that you mentioned, that was slightly an odd one because in the first wave, it behaved like a normal flu where it killed mostly older people. However, it seemed to come back in a second wave that was different. It had a different clinical pattern to it. And in that wave, it tended to affect younger people. In fact, in that case, causing a cytokine storm, basically causing the immune system to overreact and end up killing particularly young, healthy people, which was tremendously sad. There's no indication of anything like that from COVID, thank goodness. And I hope it stays that way.
It also had to do with the war. I mean, basically, the troops were bringing that stuff all around the world because, the troops were moving all around the world. So it just made the spread of it that much worse. One of the other interesting things that come out has to do with reasons or environmental reasons that COVID makes things worse. So right here, new research shows disproportionate, this is ProPublica, new research shows disproportionate rate of coronavirus deaths in polluted areas. The type of pollution emitted by many chemical plants in Louisiana industrial corridor is correlated with increased COVID deaths, according to new peer-reviewed research from SUNY and ProPublica. Basically, the pollution in the air that people are breathing and everything else increases the rate of inflammation. And that rate of inflammation basically is made worse by COVID. I mean, that's somewhat the general way that they're thinking about why this is taking place. Can you add to that? I mean, this is pretty significant. I mean, Louisiana is not the only place with pollution. And it's very possible that the aspects of climate change, the aspects of pollution and industry and those things in our country that we typically don't all that much pay attention to are killing us now, just from the standpoint of this virus, meaning it's making the virus worse. Not attending to our responsibilities from the standpoint of the water and the air is making this worse. What do you think about that? Or am I putting too much into the pollution angle?
No, you're absolutely correct. There's a very strong correlation between pollution, particularly air pollution and particulates, and having more negative outcomes from the virus. And in fact, pollution doesn't need to be terribly high. Even a modest increase in air pollution does seem to have knock-on effects with how well people can recover from infection. Something else to be mindful of is levels of vitamin D in the blood. And most of or a significant proportion of our vitamin D, we tend to get through our skin by exposing our skin to sunlight. A little bit comes from dietary sources as well. But it's particularly important that people have high vitamin D in their bloodstream for a number of reasons, but particularly for immunomodulation, so making sure that the immune system functions well. Now, that's particularly difficult for people who have darker skin, who live in northern latitudes where we don't get lots of sun the whole year round, and where sun appears to be less strong. And therefore, people with darker skin and higher latitudes are at far greater risk of negative outcomes from COVID due to that. And so I think that public health initiatives that dispense vitamin D widely to people is probably a good idea.
Let's do this. Let's go into a slightly early break so we can come back. And Nell, thank you for being with us. I want to continue this conversation. If you're cool with this, when we come back, let's talk about the streetlight effect and whether or not this is actually centered in the UK, or if they're just detecting this new strain a little bit more efficiently than other countries in the region. I want to hear your take on that. But regardless, we are joined by Nell Watson. We'll be back with her on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Watson. We are joined by Nell Watson. She's a researcher in emerging technologies whose work focuses on the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and the values of the human spirit into the development of artificial intelligence. She serves as senior scientific advisor to the Future Society AI researcher at Singularity University and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. And by the way, you can and you should follow Nell on Twitter at Nell Watson, and also check her out on her website, nellwatson.com. Nell, thank you for being with us. I saw you talking about the streetlight effect, and I'm going to let you explain it, but broadly, the idea that the United Kingdom does more sort of differential strain analysis where they're looking at different strains of COVID, and therefore they're more likely to detect these new strains. Is not necessarily the case that they have a larger prevalence of this new strain. It's just that they're seeing it more. Is that broadly true? And what makes you say that, Nell?
You know, there's the old joke of a drunk is looking for his car keys, and the policeman says, "Where did you lose them?" "Oh, way over there." "Well, why are you searching under the streetlight?" "Well, that's where the light is," right? And I think there's a potential for something similar to be occurring in the UK. So United Kingdom appears to be the ground zero of this new mutation. However, the UK does a substantial amount of screening, so kind of genetic assays of what different strains are in the population, etc. And so because of that, there might be some element of a streetlight effect, which might pinpoint the UK as having lots of this variant, when in fact it may well be that the variant is far more widespread already than anyone realizes, and perhaps the origin of this might have actually come from somewhere else. We just don't know yet. But we have to proceed on the available evidence that we have, and that does appear to show that that the UK seems to have a particularly troublesome issue with this variant strain.
That's uber interesting. I mean, is that because of the healthcare system, the national healthcare system, where these guys just put, I guess, more emphasis on it, and because there's this kind of structure there already that can deal with the healthcare issues as people come in, but that they're also doing more research into it? Is that the thought? I mean, that's because we haven't found that strain anywhere else. But like you said, I don't necessarily know if we're looking for strains like that in the United States. The number of people infected creates a higher probability of mutation, correct?
Generally speaking, yes, although you can't really know. Some scenarios might create a higher probability of a mutant variant emerging, such as this hypothesized very sick patient who had a compromised immune system, who basically had COVID for months and months on end. That seems to be an unusual event. So you can't categorically say for sure, but in the law of probabilities, more people, the greater density of population who are infected, all things being equal, yes, we would expect to see more new mutations there.
How did he keep COVID for all of that time? That's astonishing. So because he had a compromised immune system, his body wasn't able to get rid of the virus, but the virus wasn't strong enough to kill him, and so it just continued to mutate?
Essentially, yes. And it seems as if there may have been several different strains, which either the patient acquired or developed, and they kind of competed in a little cauldron within that patient, and somehow the strongest evolved and outcompeted the others, and then emerged as a particularly unusual novel mutant strain. That's the hypothesis for now, anyway.
I've also briefly heard, and I think this was even in some sort of establishment media reporting on the story, although it was peripheral and they only briefly mentioned it. Is there any possibility that this has to do not with the specific transmission to the minks in Denmark, but with human to animal transmission and then an inverted animal to human transmission, where the virus undergoes sort of several rounds of mutation and then it comes back? That just seems unlikely to me. But if you have, wide enough prevalence of the virus, maybe the sort of law of large numbers or something, it might happen. Is there any possibility that happened? If so, what do you think the likelihood there is, or is that just out of the realm?
I think that's a possibility, and I say that because at least 22 new mutations have emerged that we haven't seen before, and we don't have a genetic link between strains that would show an evolutionary path. And that means we're probably missing something. So yes, maybe it arrived in one patient, or possibly there's a population which is exchanging the virus between themselves, possibly between humans and this other creature. Maybe it's cats or dogs or rats or pigs, or who knows what it is, but it seems as if possibly we've missed something, and maybe the virus has been doing the rounds in some other animal population and then eventually crossed back into humans again. And maybe that's why we've seen this strange and novel new variant.
Now, the reason this variant is odd is because, like you said, the 23 different variations that are in the virus, and typically you guys will be able to find an intermediary between you get to that, the number of variants in the virus. This is so bizarre to me. So what do they expect? Okay, so how are they planning on dealing with it? We've done shutdowns. We've done, we've done the job thing where they shut down the economy. People have been staying at home for the most part. And it doesn't seem to be doing it. I mean, am I wrong? What's next? I mean, I know they're doing the vaccines. Is there a fear that the vaccinations will be less effective with the new strain? Or this is one of those things that is just unknown at this point?
It's very much unknown. A new strain might emerge that some vaccines might be less effective against. There are a number of different vaccines. Not all of them involve modified RNA either, but they're all at different stages of development. But it seems as if unless a strain is really particularly out there in terms of a very, very radical mutation, we can expect that the vaccines will continue to work, albeit perhaps maybe not quite as effectively as before, potentially. There are a number of other drugs, for example, such as ivermectin, which are being experimentally trialed in different parts of the world. And there is some evidence that those might provide a degree of prophylaxis against infection. There's a wide range of data on that, which appears to support that hypothesis. Perhaps now might be a good time to explore whether it's a good time to use those, to dispense them to people, particularly safe drugs like ivermectin, because maybe those might reduce the transmission rates again to a rate that is manageable, because we seem to be a little bit unmanageable at the moment with this new strain.
Stepping back for a minute, and it's a bit of a change of topic, although it's still on COVID. Looking at this from the early days of the pandemic, back in not just March, but say January or February, when we first got the inkling in the West that this was spreading and that it was potentially very serious, that it had pandemic potential. What sort of major changes administratively from a public health perspective would you have recommended to avert what appears to have become a catastrophe based, in large part on the failure of politicians and professionals to respond to this? What would you have done differently, trying to learn for the next time now?
If it were me, I probably would have shut the borders very early to control transmission. And I would have inaugurated a public health program which distributes vitamin D to all citizens, but particularly, as I said, those who are more likely to be deficient. And I would also have investigated ivermectin and similar drugs such as selamexin and moxidectin, because I do think that there is some intriguing research there that shows that those kinds of drugs may radically reduce the risk of infection onto others.
One last thing before we have about 3 minutes, give or take. The vaccine itself, you mentioned that it was that there are some vaccines that are being done outside of the RNA, and that those may have different effects than, let's say, the RNA one. What is the difference between, let's say, that vaccine versus the others? I mean, one time whatever particular reason, my body doesn't necessarily produce. In giving a vaccine, I believe it's for hepatitis C or something to that effect, it doesn't produce the antibodies for it. And so it's one of those things where it's just known and have to be continuously checked. Also, there are certain vaccines that they don't give me because they're worried about a compromised immune system basically interacting poorly with the vaccine, and in which cases they would try something else. That gets me to this question with the RNA. What are the different vaccines? What's the difference between the RNA? Why were they able to create that within the course of 6-7 months, as opposed to the years that it typically take? And what is the difference between the RNA one versus the other versions of the vaccine?
Well, the major advantage of modified RNA vaccines is that they can be very quick to prototype. In fact, I think a prototype vaccine was made within a matter of a week or two, as soon as COVID had been dissected from a genetic standpoint. As soon as we had the sequence of that, it was possible to start making an mRNA vaccine. The advantage of that is, of course, speed. We have the ability to create this new method and to deploy it. The disadvantages are that mRNA vaccines are still a rather new innovation. They may potentially have some longer-term side effects that we aren't aware of yet. Traditional vaccines, where you take a weakened or dead version of a virus, we know how those operate. However, those have a downside as well. Sometimes vaccines such as polio, which can use a weakened version of the polio virus sometimes, those can actually end up being excreted by people and then entering water sources and causing real polio, the strong kind, in other people. So we want to be very careful with those kinds of weakened versions that might come back like a cobra to bite us. mRNA doesn't use a weakened version of the virus. Rather, it uses some fragments of proteins of the virus. And for that reason, it should be more safe. And is, of course, much faster because you don't have to culture a weak version of the virus itself. So we may see alternatives to mRNA vaccines for the coronavirus later down the line, but it's likely that research will take far longer to complete than the mRNA versions.
Very cool. This has been a very interesting segment. I really want to thank you for coming on. The voice you've been listening to is Eleanor Neal Watson, researcher in emerging technologies whose work focuses on the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and the values of the human spirit into the development of AI. She serves as senior scientific advisor to the Future Society, AI researcher at Singularity University, and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. You can follow Neal on Twitter at Neal Watson and on the website neilwatson.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll